Hi, my name is Ron Toganov, and I'm a recent PhD graduate from the University of British Columbia, supervised by Marie Ojamete. I am helping organize this workshop for a DFO focused on hidden Markov models and their application in marine sciences. This workshop will be composed of 3 lectures presenting the theoretical background for hidden Markov models and 3 3-hour tutorials that we will work on together over Zoom to apply theory to real animal tracking data. In this presentation, I will briefly discuss the ecological motivations for hidden Markov models, their statistical framework in which mixture models and Markov chains are combined to make hidden Markov models, and I conclude the presentation with my PhD work on polar bear behavior as a case study. Over the past several decades, we've been collecting more and more remote biotelemetry data from animals. This includes movement data such as animals' geographic location, elevation, depth, accelerometer data, orientation relative to magnetic north, as well as physiological data such as body temperature and heart rate. The overall amount of data collected in both terrestrial and marine systems has been growing exponentially. There are many possible avenues to investigate this data. For example, with respect to movement data, we may be interested in estimating an animal's home range, where they are geographically in space and where the distribution is most concentrated. Second, we may be interested in habitat and resource selections, where we want to identify what kind of environmental conditions do animals select for example, bathymetry, sea surface temperature, or chlorophyll concentration. Next, we may be interested in parameterizing the animal's movement characteristics. For example, in this case, the graph shows the distribution of step lengths for 2 different behaviors. Fourth, we may be interested in segmenting telemetry data into discrete behavioral states and identifying when and where those occur or under which conditions. Last, if the data has high error or if we have missing records, we may be interested in path reconstruction to determine the most likely paths of the animals and where they may have been over time. Hidden Markov models address 2 of these components, mainly movement parameter estimation and behavior segmentation. And in this workshop, we will also learn some basic methods for path reconstruction. So hidden Markov models have 2 components addressing 2 fundamental challenges when using telemetry data to identify behavior. The first challenge is that the underlying biological process that the researchers are interested in is not directly observed. That is, the data stream we observe is an indirect measure of the underlying behavioral process, such that, that the observation data is conditionally dependent on the latent state process. For example, if we want to use catch data to estimate the stock size of a fish population, the true population is hidden while the observed catch is dependent on the population size. A second example, and the primary focus of this workshop, is using observed movement data to infer an unobserved or latent animal behavior. The second challenge with using animal telemetry data is that the latent state process is also autocorrelated in time. For example, in the stock assessment, the stock population size in one year is partly dependent on the population in the previous year. And animal behavior at one time is also autocorrelated depending on what the animal was doing previously. Their speed, for example, will also be autocorrelated in time. In effect, our observation data is autocorrelated through a latent state process. Hidden Markov models address these 2 challenges by combining 2 different statistical tools. For the hidden underlying process, we have finite mixture models. In the graph on the right, the red line represents the overall observed data, and the data is emergent from several hidden processes represented by the blue curves. To model the autocorrelation, hidden Markov models describe probability of the latent state using Markov chains, which state that the probability of being in one state at one time depends on what state you were in the previous time. In the Markov chain, there's a probability of staying within the same state and probability of transitioning into another state. Next, I'll go into both of these in more detail and discuss how they are combined into hidden Markov models, beginning with finite mixture models. So we'll, for now, ignore the issue of autocorrelation. So let's begin with an example where we may want to distinguish between resident and transient killer whales using photographs taken from boats. And we suspect that we could do this by measuring the curvature of the dorsal fin by calculating the maximum angle between the leading edge. The resident and transient orcas represent two possible components or groups an image can represent. What we don't know is how frequent each group is. That is, what is the overall probability of a photo might be from the component representing resident or transient whales. In this case, the probability of a photo being in component 1 is 0.75, and the probability of being in component 2 is 0.25. We also don't know the distribution of the dorsal fin angles associated with each component. In this case, component 1 has a lower mean and standard deviation compared to for component 2. So component 1 has a density centered around 15, and component 2 has a probability density centered around 25. What we actually observe are the angles. And after many measurements, we may obtain the overall cumulative density on the right, which again is the combination of the two hidden components. In this case, the first image we process happens to be of an individual from component 1, which we don't know. But from this, we obtain a measure of 14.2. So the individual's measure can be thought of as a sample from the population. The next individual happens to be from component 2, and thus its observation is sampled from the population associated with component 2 and happens to be 29.4. In the next measure, it happens to be in component 1. We measure 8.9, and this is repeated for all observations. And for each observation, it's drawn from the associated component based on what component is in. Now, the goal of the finite mixture model is to estimate the parameters associated with each component's probability, density, as well as the weights or probabilities associated with being in each component. All right, so what are the key parameters of the finite mixture model? The first parameter that's defined by the practitioner is the number of components, or the number of states an observation might come from. And this is represented by the letter M. In the example above, there are two components, so M would equal 2. The second parameter is the weight of each component I, represented by delta I, such that each component has its own weight. In this case, is 0.75 and 0.25. Together, they must sum up to 1 since the system has to be in one of the states. Third, each component has its own associated probability distributions represented by pi. Each distribution is defined by some parameters, which can be represented by theta. For example, if the possible measurements are normally distributed, we may need to estimate the mean and the standard deviation for each component I. Again, the researcher defines the number of components, and the finite mixture model would estimate the values of delta and theta. The parameters are estimated by maximizing the likelihood of the finite mixture model. In this case, the likelihood is calculating the probability of the observed data from the first observation x1 to your last observation xn. Given the parameters for each component, their weights, and the weights of each component. In the example above, m equals 2, so we have two sets of thetas and two sets of deltas. The likelihood is calculated by multiplying the probability of each observation given the component distribution by the weight of that component, then summing across all the components that can produce that observation. For example, if we have a measurement of 10, we would sum the probability of obtaining that from P1 plus the probability of obtaining that from P2. And lastly, we would multiply across all the observations from observation j equals 1 to j equals n. Excellent. So that's the hidden part of hidden Markov models. Now let's define the Markov half. So as you recall, the second component of hidden Markov models is the Markov chain, and that's addressing the autocorrelation in the underlying latent state. The premise of Markov chains is that the system is in discrete states in time, and the states are autocorrelated. For example, a polar bear may be walking at first, then running for some time, then walking again. A Markov chain has two elements: all the possible components and all the transitions among those components. In a basic hidden Markov chain, we can have two possible states, state 1, which is blue, and state 2, which is red. And we have probabilities of remaining within the blue state, a probability of transitioning from the blue state to the red state, probability of remaining within the red state, and probability of transitioning from the red to the blue state. We can say that a sequence of discrete random variable CT is a discrete time Markov chain if for all time steps, the probability of a component at time t plus 1 conditioned on the entire history of components from t1 to t is equal to the probability of component t plus 1 conditioned only on the component at time t. In other words, the Markov chain is conditioned or conditioning on the entire history of the process up until time t is equivalent to conditioning only on the most recent value of CT, such that the probability of being in a state at one time depends only on the state you were in the previous time step. There are two key elements defined by the Markov chain. First, it's the number of possible states represented by the letter m, and second is the transition probabilities among the states. A transition between two states is defined by gamma, where gamma ij represents the probability that you are in state j at time t plus 1, given that you were in state I in the previous time step t. In a basic hidden Markov model, we must estimate gamma for staying within each state and a gamma for all the possible transitions among the states. In the case on the right, we would have 4 parameters: staying within the state and transition. All gammas can be represented in what's called the transition probability matrix. In this matrix, each row represents the possible starting state, and each column represents the possible state transitioning into. For example, the very first cell, which is row 1, column 1, represents the probability of starting in state 1 and in the following time step remaining in state 1. The cell to the right of that is the probability of starting in state 1 and transitioning into state 2. The second row would be starting in state 2, transitioning into state 1, or starting into state 2 and transitioning into state 2. And if you have more than 2 states, this would extend up until the last cell, which represents the probability of remaining within the final state in the chain. In other words, this matrix represents the probabilities of transitioning from any state to any other state or remaining within the same state. Now, a key feature of the transition probability matrix, which is represented by the capital letter gamma, is that each row must sum up to 1. Because if you are in some state, you must transition into something or remain in the same state. However, this is not necessarily true for the columns. Now, this is best illustrated with an example. Here we have a 2-state Markov chain where there's a 25% probability of remaining within the blue state, a 75% probability of transitioning into the red state. And for the red state, there's an 80% probability remaining within the same state and a 20% probability transitioning into the blue state. Here, the blue gammas must sum up to 1, and the red gammas must also sum up to 1. Now, the probability matrix for this Markov chain would look like this. Again, the first row represents the transitions from state 1, and the second row represents the transitions from state 2. So we see that the first cell corresponds to remaining within the same state. 0.75 is transitioning from row 1 to state 2. And the same for the red, where the first cell is starting in state 2 and transitioning into state 1, which is 0.2. And the last cell is the probability of starting in state 2 and ending in state 2, so remaining within the red state. And here you can see how each row sums up to 1, but that's not the case for the columns, and that's totally fine. The handy thing about storing the gammas in a probability matrix is that we can use matrix multiplication. So if we define UT as a vector containing the probabilities of being in each of the possible states at time t, so at time t, the probability that you're in state 1, state 2, all the way to state m, then we can calculate u at time t plus 1 simply by multiplying ut by the transition probability matrix gamma. This is, again, best illustrated with an example. So if we use the same Markov chain as before, let's assume that at time t, we know that the system is in state 1. So ut is a vector 0, 1, or sorry, 1, 0. And to estimate the probability of each state at the next time step, we multiply u1 by gamma, and we see, as expected, that there's a 25% chance that we remain in state 1, a 75% chance that we're in state 2, right? That's what's predicted by the transition matrix. Next, we can multiply this again by gamma to see the probabilities of the states at time 3 to be 0.21 and 0.78. And we can repeat this for as long as we want to see the probability at any given time. So now we have both elements needed to define the hidden Markov model, finite mixture model, and the Markov chains. Simply put, a hidden Markov model is a mixture model where the weights are defined by a Markov chain. As you recall, a mixture model states that there are some finite number of components, each with their own respective weights and emission probabilities. Now, hidden Markov models build on this by specifying that the states are actually dependent on one another through time, following a Markov chain, where each state has a probability of remaining within itself or transitioning into the other state. From the example on the right, the system begins in state 2, which has a corresponding state distribution that produces an observation of 31. In the following time step, the state transitions into state 1, from which we obtain an observation of 16. And the following state transitions are governed by the Markov chain. And we see that the probability of remaining within state 1 is 0.9. The probability of transitioning from state 1 into state 2 is 0.1. For the second state, there's a probability of 0.7 of remaining within the same state, and a probability of 0.3 of transitioning into the blue state, into state 1. Next, let's define the key parameters of hidden Markov models. So as before, the number of states is defined by the practitioner and denoted by the letter M. The state probability at time t, given the state at time t minus 1, is represented by this PR. The emission probability is defined as the probability of observing x at time t given the latent state at time t. And the state-dependent distribution represents the state-specific probability of observing x given that at that time you were in state I. And this is represented by the probability P for state I for observation X. Next, we can define capital P of X as a diagonal matrix for probability of observation X associated with each state from state 1 to state M. So this diagonal matrix represents all the ways we may observe X. So there's only values on the diagonal from the top left to bottom right, and all other values are 0. If you recall, we previously defined UT as the vector of probabilities of being in each state from state 1 to state M, and multiplying UT by PX and a column vector of 1s gives us the overall probability of observing X at time t, given all the possible states we may be in and their respective probabilities. Now, the reason we're multiplying by a column vector of 1s is in effect to sum the state-dependent probabilities to obtain one value for observation X. Finally, we can put everything together by obtaining to obtain the hidden Markov model likelihood. Now, our first instinct might be to simply take all the probabilities of each component or of each observation X from time t0 or t1 to the final observation t and multiply them. However, this does not work because it does not account for the autocorrelation in the latent state. That is, the probability of making an observation X at time t is dependent on the observation at time t minus 1 through the hidden autocorrelated state. The actual likelihood of the hidden Markov model, we begin with the initial state distribution at time t equals 1. So this is equivalent to u at when t equals 1, which we defined earlier as the vector of state probabilities. Next, we multiply this initial state distribution by the emission probability matrix given the observation to calculate the cumulative probability of the first observation. Next, we multiply this by the transition probability matrix to calculate the state distribution at time 2. We again multiply this by the probability matrix to calculate the observation at time 2. Again, we multiply it by gamma and p recursively until the last observation. We again conclude by multiplying by a column vector of 1s to obtain a value that represents the overall HMM likelihood. Given all the repetition in this likelihood, it can be written more succinctly as follows. So the likelihood is equal to the initial state distribution multiplied by the observation probability, then multiplying recursively by the transition matrix and the respective observation probability, and from time t equals 2 to the final observation. And last, again, we conclude by multiplying by a column vector of 1s. So to give a concrete example of the application of hidden Markov models, the rest of this presentation will describe how I applied them to my PhD to investigate polar bear behavioral ecology. So polar bears rely on sea ice for access to their primary prey, ring seals and bearded seals. However, due to increasing global temperatures over the past several decades, sea ice extent and volume have both been decreasing. This decreases the available area for polar bears to access seals and also shortens the winter foraging season as freeze up occurs later and breakup occurs earlier. And as the environment continues to change, it's critical to identify environmental conditions polar bears rely on for foraging. Polar bears' sea ice habitat is vast, complex, and dynamic, and makes visual search alone inadequate for locating prey. For example, these pressure ridges can account for up to 40% of sea ice volume and have a mean height of 2 meters, creating significant visual barriers. Therefore, polar bears rely greatly on their sense of smell or olfaction to locate prey. In the presence of wind, odors produced by seals are carried downwind in an odor plume. If a bear smells a seal, it should travel upwind to locate the source. However, if the bear has no information on prey distribution, theory suggests that they should travel crosswind to maximize their chance of encountering an odor plume. Now, one of the main challenges studying polar bears is the dynamic and moving nature of their sea ice habitat. So one of the key issues is that as the animal moves through the environment also moves the animal, such that the overall movement that we observe from the tracking data is the combination of the voluntary movement by the animal plus the involuntary movement imparted onto them by the environment. Now, the primary driver of sea ice drift is wind, and because of the Coriolis effect, drift occurs at a slight angle to the right of wind. So I used polar bears as a case study to identify 3 behavioral states. First, when the bears are stationary and passively drifting on the sea ice, for example, if they're still hunting by a breathing hole or if they're resting, their movement occurs at a slight angle to the right of wind. Second, during olfactory search, polar bears are assumed to move roughly crosswind. And third, during area-restricted search, movement is assumed to be independent of wind. To get at behavior, my thesis relied on location data obtained from GPS collars deployed on female bears. This animation depicts the motion of one female bear in 2011, and the challenge is to segment this into different behaviors and identify the conditions associated with the different behaviors. As you may have guessed, I used hidden Markov models to identify behaviors from the tracking data. As a review, the true behavior of the bear is assumed to be discrete states that are hidden and not directly observed. and the probabilities of being in one state at some time depends on the state at the previous time step as governed by a Markov chain. From the GPS tracking data, I obtain movement metrics such as step length and turning angle, and these were assumed to be probabilistically related or dependent on the underlying latent state. So I obtain a time series of step lengths and turning angles that are dependent on each other through the underlying latent state. Now, to bring in the notation from earlier in the lecture, the transition probability matrix is represented by the arrows between states, and the emission probability matrix P of x is represented by the arrows from the latent state to the observed data streams. Now, in a basic HMM, where we're measuring step length and turning angle, and we have two states, for example, area-restricted search and olfactory search, we may expect that during area-restricted search, movement is slower and turning angle is more widely distributed. And during olfactory search, movement is faster and more concentrated, which gives us the overall observed distribution in black. Now, to investigate additional behaviors, I made several extensions to this basic hidden Markov model. First, I included an additional third state to represent any stationary behaviors where the bear might be passively drifting. Again, either still hunting or resting. And to help identify crosswind olfactory search, I needed to also incorporate orientation relative to wind. So to do this, I modeled the observed data streams as functions of environmental covariates. For example, modeling turning angle as a function of wind. Now, movement with an angled bias relative to external stimuli is defined as menotaxis. Now, to model movement with an angle bias relative to an external factor, such as wind, I developed a menotactic bias correlated random walk. The model described turning angle as a trade-off between directional persistence, a bias parallel to the stimulus, and a bias perpendicular to the stimulus. This framework does not make any assumptions about the angle of the bias relative to the stimulus, and it can describe movement as purely autocorrelated, strictly biased, or as a trade-off between bias and correlated random walk. I had to make two additional modifications to the Markov chain. First, during olfactory search, bears would generally maintain one direction relative to wind, either to the left or right of wind, and this is best represented with two discrete states, olfactory search to the left and olfactory search to the right of wind. Second, when bears are stationary and passively drifting on the sea ice, their motion is primarily driven by wind. However, because wind is also autocorrelated, the bear movement can look more like a correlated random walk and be misclassified as having no bias relative to wind, right? This movement looks very autocorrelated. However, the first step of drift is independent of the previous time step and should exhibit a bias relative to wind. Therefore, I divided drift into two additional states, the transition into drift on the left and all the consequent drift states. So if a bear is in the transition to drift state, it must transition in the following step into a drifting state. But for all other states, the bear can remain within those states. If a bear is in a drifting state, it can transition into olfactory search or area-restricted search. Those two can transition into each other, or they can transition into the transition into drift state. So this framework is particularly important when the tracking data is at a higher spatial or temporal resolution than the environmental data. In my case, the collar had a 30-minute resolution compared to the 1-hour resolution of wind. Next, I was also interested in using hidden Markov models to model the effects of environmental conditions, such as ice concentration, on behavior probability. So hidden Markov models are very well suited for this, as they can model the state transition probabilities as functions of covariates. For example, we may expect that at low ice concentration, that increases the probability of transitioning to olfactory search, looking for better habitat, and areas of high ice concentration may promote transitioning into area restricted search or stationary hunting behaviors. We can also look at other covariates such as effective wind speed or time of day. So this map shows the behavioral states as predicted by the model. These black vectors represent wind directions and speed. In orange and red, we have olfactory search to the left and right of wind respectively. In blue is the drifting states, and the plot also illustrates how autocorrelated drift can look, and also how bias relative to wind is exhibited primarily by the first step of drift, while all consequent steps look very autocorrelated. So my analysis identified 6 covariates that significantly affected state probability: hour, date of the year, ice concentration, distance to shore, wind speed, and bear age. For brevity, I'll just interpret the results from hour. So this plot shows the state probability predicted based on hour of the day. The main pattern observed was that during the early hours of the day, the bears were more likely to be in a drifting state, and in the later hours of the day, they were more likely to transition into olfactory search. Now, this nicely mirrored the known patterns of seal haul-out behavior, where during the cooler nights and early morning hours, seals are more likely to remain in the water and only surface to breathe, which may favor still hunting. Conversely, as temperatures increase during the day, seals are more likely to haul out, which may favor stalking and active predation. So more active movement searching for prey. Last, I looked at the spatial distribution of different behaviors with respect to the core range and the submarine grounds in green. The main pattern that I observed was that polar bears were more likely to remain in resident states, so drifting or area restricted search, near the core of their range, and near the periphery, they were more likely to engage in higher active states, such as olfactory search, perhaps searching more for quality habitat. In addition, I compared years with high ice concentration with years with low ice concentration. Most notably, in years with high ice concentration, bears remained primarily within their core range, and in years with low ice concentration, they strayed further from the core range, which could either be them moving further in search of high quality habitat, or the more dynamic sea ice causing them to drift further from their range. So hidden Markov models are very flexible and extendable. Some of the work I presented could be used, for example, to investigate sea turtle navigation relative to ocean currents and magnetic fields, or the flight of seabirds relative to winds and anthropogenic factors such as wind turbines or fishing vessels. So that concludes the first lecture. You can now proceed to watch the other lectures, or if you're watching the day of the presentation, prepare for the workshop. And I look forward to seeing you. Thank you.